Welcome to Buried Truths, where the dust of time is swept away and history's deepest secrets rise to the surface. The origins of the space race trace back to the final days of World War II. As Nazi Germany collapsed, both the United States and the Soviet Union rushed to capture German rocket scientists. These scientists had developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Among them was Wernher von Braun, who would become a key figure in American space efforts. In Operation Paperclip, the U.S. secretly brought over 1,600 German scientists, including von Braun, to work on American missile and space technology. Simultaneously, the Soviets captured their own set of German engineers, launching a parallel effort. The rivalry that would define the Cold War was already taking shape. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. This deepened the urgency on both sides to achieve technological superiority, including in space. The Cold War was not just about military power. It became a competition for global prestige. In 1955, both nations publicly declared their intentions to launch artificial satellites during the International Geophysical Year, 1957 to 1958. President Eisenhower approved Project Vanguard, the United States' first official satellite program. Meanwhile, the Soviets began working on a secret satellite project under chief designer Sergei Korolev, whose identity was classified. At the time, had survived Stalin's gulags and emerged as the mastermind behind Soviet rocketry. Under his leadership, the USSR repurposed the R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile into a satellite launch vehicle. Unlike the U.S., which emphasized scientific cooperation, the Soviets prioritized a dramatic first strike to stun the world. On October 4, 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. The 83.6-kilogram metal sphere emitted beeping radio signals as it orbited Earth. It was a technological and psychological shock to the United States. The space race had officially begun. Sputnik's success demonstrated that the Soviet Union had the capability to launch nuclear warheads across continents. Americans feared that the USSR had taken the lead in missile and space technology. Public anxiety grew rapidly. U.S. newspapers called it a Sputnik crisis. President Eisenhower downplayed the immediate threat, but behind the scenes, urgency surged. Funding for science and engineering education skyrocketed. The Department of Defense rapidly escalated missile development programs, while NASA's creation was already being considered. The Soviets struck again on November 3, 1957, by launching Sputnik 2, carrying a living creature, Laika the dog, into orbit. Although Laika died from overheating a few hours after launch, the mission showed that space travel with living beings was possible. It further widened the perceived Soviet lead. American attempts to respond were troubled. The Vanguard TV-3 rocket exploded on the launch pad on December 6, 1957, in full view of the press. The failure was dubbed Flopnik and became a national embarrassment. In the aftermath, the U.S. turned to the Army Ballistic Missile Agency and Wernher von Braun to salvage the situation. Project Explorer was fast-tracked. On January 31, 1958, the United States finally succeeded with Explorer 1, the first American satellite, which discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. Though the U.S. had now entered space, the Soviets had won the first round. The space race had transformed from a scientific endeavor into a geopolitical showdown. The years ahead would see both nations pour immense resources into space exploration, not just to understand the cosmos, but to win hearts, minds, and dominance. The launch of Explorer 1 in January 1958 marked America's entry into the space age, but it also triggered a rapid intensification of the space race. Just months later, the United States formally established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, on July 29, 1958. NASA absorbed earlier military space projects and became the civilian spearhead of America's space ambitions. NASA's formation signaled a strategic shift. Rather than treating space purely as a military frontier, the U.S. now aimed to showcase scientific leadership and peaceful exploration. The Soviets, however, continued using military resources under Sergei Korolev's secretive program. The Cold War's ideological battle was now fully extended into space. On May 28, 1959, the U.S. launched Able and Baker, two monkeys who became the first living beings to return safely from space. This successful biological mission built confidence in the potential for human spaceflight. The Soviets, meanwhile, had already begun testing human-rated systems for their Vostok capsule. By 1960, both sides were racing to be the first to send a human into space. The Soviets conducted several test flights with mannequins and animals. One such mission, Korabl Sputnik 2, launched dogs Belka and Strelka, who returned alive, proving the Vostok system's readiness. The U.S. focused on Project Mercury, its first human spaceflight program. The Mercury 7 astronauts were introduced to the public in 1959 and became national heroes overnight. Their training included extreme physical and psychological tests to prepare for the unknown conditions of space. Despite setbacks, NASA made progress. In January 1961, a chimpanzee named Ham became the first great ape in space, demonstrating that humans could control spacecraft systems under stress. But while America prepared carefully, the USSR aimed for a bold, sudden achievement. On April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space aboard Vostok 1. His 108-minute orbital flight stunned the world. Gagarin was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, traveled once around Earth, and landed safely. He instantly became an international hero and a symbol of Soviet technological prowess. The United States was once again caught off guard. Gagarin's flight demonstrated not just Soviet superiority in rocketry, but also their ability to mobilize massive resources in secrecy. In the aftermath, U.S. leaders faced public pressure to catch up. Just weeks later, on May 5, 1961, American astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space. Flying aboard Freedom 7, Shepard's suborbital flight lasted only 15 minutes, but it proved that America could launch and recover a human safely. The gap was narrowing. President John F. Kennedy used this momentum to make a bold declaration. On May 25, 1961, in a speech before Congress, Kennedy stated that the United States should commit to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade's end. This ambitious goal would define the next phase of the space race. Kennedy's announcement transformed the competition. No longer just a matter of firsts, the space race became a test of national willpower, industrial strength, and scientific innovation. The challenge was immense. NASA had never even attempted an orbital rendezvous, let alone a lunar mission. The Soviets, emboldened by Gagarin's success, doubled down on crewed space flights. In August 1961, German Titov completed a 25-hour mission aboard Vostok 2, becoming the youngest person to fly in space at age 25. The USSR was not slowing down. As 1961 ended, both superpowers had achieved critical milestones, but the moon, now, loomed as the ultimate prize. Behind the scenes, both NASA and the Soviet Space Agency began drafting complex mission plans that would define the decade to come. Following President Kennedy's moon challenge, the United States intensified efforts through Project Mercury. On February 20, 1962, astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth aboard Friendship 7. His 3 orbits were a national triumph, marking a significant comeback after Gagarin's earlier achievement. John Glenn's flight was broadcast live and watched by millions. He splashed down safely in the Atlantic and was instantly hailed as a hero. His success validated NASA's capabilities and lifted American morale, signaling that the U.S. could keep pace with the Soviets in manned spaceflight. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union expanded its Vostok program. On August 11-12, 1962, Vostok 3 and Vostok 4 were launched into orbit less than a day apart, with cosmonauts Andrian Nikolaev and Pavel Popovich aboard. This marked the first time two crewed spacecraft were in space simultaneously, though they did not dock or meet. The Soviets were also preparing for more ambitious flights. In June 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space, flying solo aboard Vostok 6. A textile worker turned cosmonaut, her mission lasted nearly 3 days and made global headlines, especially in the context of gender equality and Soviet progress. In contrast, NASA's Mercury program was nearing its limits. While it demonstrated the feasibility of human spaceflight, Mercury capsules lacked maneuverability and room for multiple astronauts. NASA began planning for a more advanced program, Project Gemini, but the transition would take time. During this phase, the Soviets launched their Voskhod program, a modified version of the Vostok capsule. In October 1964, Voskhod 1 carried 3 cosmonauts without spacesuits in a record-breaking multi-crew mission. This was followed by Voskhod 2 in March 1965, which included the first-ever spacewalk by Alexei Leonov. Leonov exited the capsule while in orbit, tethered only by a cord, floating freely in the vacuum of space. Though the walk lasted just 12 minutes, it demonstrated capabilities the U.S. had yet to match. Leonov nearly failed to re-enter the airlock due to his suit inflating, but he managed to survive, barely. NASA responded with its Gemini program, launching its first crewed flight, Gemini 3, on March 23, 1965. Astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young demonstrated in-space maneuvering by manually changing their orbit using onboard controls. This was critical training for future lunar missions. Gemini represented a shift from short suborbital flights to extended missions with complex objectives. It introduced space rendezvous, docking, long-duration flights, and EVAs, extravehicular activities, essential components of the future Apollo missions. The Soviets maintained a lead in firsts, but their successes were increasingly secretive, and many failures were hidden from the public. In contrast, NASA broadcast nearly every moment, including its setbacks, reinforcing the perception of transparency and openness in the American approach. Throughout 1964 and 1965, both nations continued, launching satellites, biological experiments, and robotic probes. The U.S. launched Mariner 4 in July 1965, which became the first spacecraft to return close-up images of Mars, showing a cratered, moon-like surface that surprised scientists. Though the moon was still years away, each side was developing larger rockets. The Soviets continued testing their N-1 lunar booster, while the U.S. invested heavily in the development of the Saturn V and eventually the Saturn V, the massive rocket intended for lunar travel. By the end of 1965, the balance was shifting. The Soviet Union had achieved many early firsts, but the U.S. was rapidly building infrastructure, technology, and experience to take the lead. With Gemini flights progressing and Apollo plans underway, the next stage of the space race promised even higher stakes and greater risks. By 1966, both superpowers were deep into advanced development for manned lunar missions. The United States launched multiple Gemini missions, each building technical capability for future Apollo flights. Rendezvous, docking, long-duration missions, and spacewalks became routine for American astronauts. Gemini 8, launched in March 1966, was commanded by Neil Armstrong and David Scott. It achieved the first docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit but encountered a critical roll due to a stuck thruster. Armstrong's quick response saved the crew, proving the importance of astronaut skill in emergencies. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued secretive tests with the Soyuz spacecraft, intended to replace the Voskhod and eventually transport cosmonauts to the moon. The first flight, Soyuz 1, launched on April 23, 1967, with Vladimir Komarov aboard. It was plagued with problems from launch. Tragically, Soyuz 1 ended in disaster when its parachutes failed during re-entry. Komarov was killed on impact, becoming the first human to die during a spaceflight. The Soviet government kept the details hidden initially, but the incident underscored the dangers of space travel and setbacks in the USSR's lunar program. In the US, optimism turned to tragedy as well. On January 27, 1967, a pre-launch test for Apollo 1 ended in a fatal fire on the launch pad. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee perished in the sealed command module when faulty wiring ignited flammable materials inside the capsule. The loss shocked the nation. Investigations revealed major design flaws, including poor hatch design, exposed wiring, and lack of safety protocols. NASA paused all manned missions and launched a full redesign of the Apollo spacecraft. The incident led to the most comprehensive overhaul in American space engineering history. During this period, the Soviets were attempting complex lunar mission strategies using Earth orbit rendezvous, since their N-1 rocket was not yet proven. They also tested lunar robotic probes to map the moon and validate landing trajectories. However, multiple launches failed or underperformed. The U.S., now behind in crewed spaceflight due to the Apollo 1 fire, focused on robotic missions like Surveyor, which soft-landed on the moon in 1966 and 1967. These missions provided valuable data on the lunar surface, confirming that it could support a lander without sinking into dust. With the redesigned Apollo Block 2 spacecraft ready, Apollo 7 launched in October 1968 as the first successful crewed Apollo mission. Commanded by Wally Schirra, it demonstrated life support, maneuvering, and communication systems in Earth orbit, paving the way for lunar missions. Simultaneously, the Soviet lunar program was deteriorating. Their N-1 rocket experienced multiple, catastrophic failures on the launch pad, including an explosion in 1969 that destroyed the entire facility. Soviet secrecy prevented the world from knowing the extent of these failures at the time. The U.S. began preparing Apollo 8 for an ambitious mission, orbiting the moon. Initially intended as an Earth orbital test, changing circumstances prompted NASA to send the spacecraft to lunar orbit, an unprecedented leap. The decision was partly driven by intelligence that the Soviets might attempt a similar feat before year's end. By late 1968, despite the earlier tragedy, the U.S. was gaining momentum. While the Soviets maintained robotic successes, their manned lunar efforts stalled due to unreliable heavy rockets and political struggles within their space leadership. The Americans, having weathered Apollo 1, were now poised to take the lead. The stage was set for Apollo 8 to attempt the boldest human mission yet, leaving Earth's orbit and circling the moon. The entire world would be watching as the space race entered its final phase, a race toward the lunar surface itself. In December 1968, Apollo 8 became a milestone mission. Initially slated to test the Apollo spacecraft in Earth orbit, it was quickly repurposed as a daring attempt to orbit the moon. This shift was partly driven by intelligence that the Soviets were planning to send a spacecraft to orbit the moon by the end of the year. The U.S. could not afford to lose the momentum gained from its previous successes. Commanded by Frank Borman, with Jim Lovell and William Anders, Apollo 8 launched on December 21, 1968. The crew spent 3 days in space, becoming the first humans to leave Earth's orbit. As the spacecraft passed into the moon's gravitational pull, they were struck by awe and wonder, seeing the dark side of the moon and the Earth in the distance for the first time. On Christmas Eve, the crew of Apollo 8 made history again by broadcasting "Live from Lunar Orbit." Their broadcast included the famous image of Earthrise, Earth rising over the barren lunar surface, a powerful symbol of humanity's achievement. In the program, the crew read from the book of Genesis, bringing a touch of humanity's spiritual side to the mission. The broadcast resonated around the world, reinforcing the United States' position in the space race. While Apollo 8 succeeded, the Soviet Union struggled. The N-1 rocket, which the Soviets hoped would carry cosmonauts to the moon, failed in 4 consecutive launches. Each failure led to further delays and a loss of confidence in the Soviet lunar program. Meanwhile, the Soviet space leadership, which had originally envisioned sending a cosmonaut to the moon before the U.S., was in turmoil. In contrast, NASA was racing ahead with its plans. The Apollo 8 mission provided crucial data about the moon's environment, testing vital elements of the upcoming lunar landing. The crew's successful return to Earth provided confidence that the Apollo program could handle longer and more complicated missions. With the success of Apollo 8, NASA's next step was Apollo 9. This mission, launched in March 1969, focused on testing the lunar module, LM, which would eventually land on the moon. The LM had never been flown before and was an essential piece of the lunar landing plan. During Apollo 9, astronauts James McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Schweickart performed multiple rendezvous and docking maneuvers in Earth orbit to ensure the spacecraft could operate in the harsh conditions of space. As Apollo 9's mission concluded successfully, the United States was more confident than ever that it could meet President Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Yet, the Soviet Union, despite the N-1's repeated failures, was still working on lunar programs. However, after the last N-1 failure in 1972, the Soviets abandoned the idea of sending a man to the moon, signaling the final blow to their aspirations to beat the U.S. in the space race. As NASA prepared for Apollo 10, a complete mission rehearsal for the first moon landing, the U.S. was within touching distance of achieving what had seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The momentum from Apollo 8 and 9 led to the creation of a robust space program that continued to push boundaries in the space exploration field. But despite these successes, the Soviets were already pivoting to new, less visible space endeavors. Their efforts were now aimed at robotic exploration, including Luna 16, which successfully brought lunar soil back to Earth in 1970. Yet, this was no match for the magnitude of a manned lunar landing. NASA's Apollo 10, launched in May 1969, became the final mission to test all systems for the lunar landing. The astronauts did everything except land on the moon, ensuring that all systems were operational for Apollo 11. After that, it was clear the U.S. would soon become the first nation to land humans on the moon, an achievement that would cap the space race in a spectacular victory. On July 16, 1969, NASA launched Apollo 11, the mission that would forever etch its name in history. Commanded by Neil Armstrong, with Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, Apollo 11's goal was clear: land on the moon and return safely to Earth. This mission, the culmination of years of development, was the realization of President John F. Kennedy's 1961 challenge to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. As Apollo 11 made its way toward the moon, tensions were high. The world watched, holding its breath as the spacecraft traveled the vast expanse of space. On July 19th, the spacecraft entered lunar orbit, setting the stage for the historic landing. Meanwhile, Armstrong and Aldrin prepared for the descent to the moon's surface, while Collins remained in orbit aboard the command module, awaiting their return. The landing site was located in the Sea of Tranquility, a flat region on the moon's surface. The descent began on July 20th, with Armstrong at the controls of the lunar module, nicknamed Eagle. As the descent proceeded, Armstrong and Aldrin encountered unexpected difficulties, including a slightly off-course trajectory and low fuel levels. With only seconds of fuel remaining, Armstrong took manual control of the descent, guiding the Eagle to a successful landing. At 2:56 UTC, the world held its breath as Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. His words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind," became immortalized in history. Aldrin soon joined him, and the two astronauts spent approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes exploring the moon, collecting samples, and deploying scientific instruments. They planted the American flag, and Aldrin left a reflective message on a plaque, reading, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969 AD, we came in peace for all mankind." The significance of the Apollo 11 landing was not just scientific but symbolic. It marked the United States' victory in the space race, proving its technological and scientific supremacy over the Soviet Union. The moment was broadcast live to millions of people around the world, who watched in awe as humanity took its first steps on another celestial body. Back on Earth, celebrations erupted. The U.S. had achieved what had once seemed impossible. The Soviet Union, which had been poised to take the lead in the space race, was forced to acknowledge the achievement. The Soviets had been unable to send humans to the moon, and with Apollo 11, the U.S. had claimed victory. The return journey for Apollo 11 was just as dramatic. After spending about 21 hours on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin re-entered the lunar module and began their ascent back to the command module. On July 24th, after a successful splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, Apollo 11 was recovered by the U.S. Navy, completing one of the most remarkable missions in history. Following Apollo 11, NASA continued with a series of successful missions, including Apollo 12, Apollo 14, Apollo 15, and beyond, further cementing the U.S.'s dominance in space exploration. However, the historic achievement of Apollo 11 remained the pinnacle, with its impact felt far beyond the world of space exploration. The moon landing marked a new era in human exploration and set the stage for future advancements in space technology. Contrast, the Soviet Union was left reeling. Despite ongoing efforts, it had never succeeded in sending humans to the moon. Instead, they shifted their focus to space stations like Salyut, where they would achieve significant milestones in the development of long-term human spaceflight. But the Soviet space program, though capable of impressive achievements, would never regain the momentum it had during the early years of the space race. The victory of Apollo 11 was not just a triumph for the United States, but for humanity. It proved that with determination, innovation, and collaboration, the impossible could be achieved. The legacy of Apollo 11 continues to inspire generations of scientists, engineers, and dreamers to look toward the stars and beyond. If you're passionate about uncovering the forgotten stories of our past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying the journey so far, and stay tuned, because there's so much more history waiting to be unearthed right here on Buried Truths.